everyone, and welcome to the second video on life on Earth. You should now know all about ecosystems, and you should be able to pause the video and answer the starter question before I go over the answers. So you need to match the numbers and the correct letters. So the answers are that the total number of organisms of the same species living in a habitat would be 8 to population. Number 2, a biological unit of environment that consists of all of the living things and non-living things with which they interact would be D, which would be your ecosystem. Number 3, all of the organisms in an ecosystem would be your community, which is G. Number 4, the place where an organism lives, which would be your habitat, which is F. Number 5, a non-living thing that affects biodiversity in an ecosystem, e.g. light intensity, temperature, pH and moisture, would be C, which is your abiotic factors. 6, allows a representative picture of types and numbers of organisms present to be determined in an ecosystem, would be your A, which is your sampling. 7, a living thing that affects the biodiversity in an ecosystem, so e.g. predation, grazing, competition and disease, which would be your biotic factors, which is E. And lastly, the variety and number of different plants and animal species living together in an ecosystem would be B, which is biodiversity. So well done if you managed to get all of them correct. If you didn't and you struggle to get the answers, remember you can go back and watch the last video of the part that you were struggling with as many times as you want. Today we're going to be moving on to biotic factors, which is part of key area 2, distribution of organisms. If you want the worksheets to go with the video, remember to pause the video and go to Free Life on Earth 2, distribution of organisms, 2 consumables and activities. The PowerPoint is found in PowerPoint and is called 2, distribution of organisms. Today we're going to be learning about biotic factors and sampling. Our learning intention is to define the ecological terms predator, prey, grazing, abiotic and biotic. State what competition is and identify what plants and animals compete for. Know the difference between intra-specific competition and interspecific competition. Describe how abiotic and biotic factors affect biodiversity. Describe how to sample plants and animals. State possible sources of error with each method and explain how to minimize them. And create and use branched and paired statement keys to identify organisms. To be successful, you will be able to tell the difference between biotic and abiotic factors. You'll be able to write down the difference between intraspecific and interspecific competition and identify diagrams of the different types of competition. You'll be able to draw a graph of grazing and explain its effects on organisms. You'll be able to draw a graph of predator and prey interactions and explain how it affects organisms. You'll be able to write down how abiotic factors affect biodiversity. Create a table to summarize how you sample plants and animals, which includes the possible sources of error and how you might minimize them. And use and create branched and paired statement keys to identify organisms. If we were in class, we would usually play a splat game where you pick one of the words and say whether it's an abiotic or biotic factor. But instead, you can pause the video and write down the words you think are abiotic and the words that you think are biotic before I go over the answers. The answers are that competition, predation, grazing, disease, parasitism, and availability of food are all biotic factors because they involve living things, whereas abiotic factors would be your soil moisture, carbon dioxide level, rainfall, phosphate concentration, wind speed, light intensity, pH, air humidity, nitrate content of the soil, temperature, river flow speed, and oxygen concentration. Well done if you managed to get that correct. Can you remember what the terms biotic factor and biodiversity mean from the last video? Try to write it down before I go over the answer to each. So the answer is that biodiversity is the variety of different types of species present in an ecosystem, and a biotic factor is population number. So, for example, this might be competition for resources, disease, food availability, grazing, and predation. Biotic factors affect biodiversity. So, for example, if food increases, so if food availability increases, then biodiversity might increase. If predators increase, biodiversity may decrease because the predators would eat some of the organisms. So let's look at this in more detail. Can you remember what the biotic factors are and how they're going to affect this rabbit? So biotic factors could be predation, competition, disease, and grazing. And biotic factors are factors related to living things, e.g. competition for food or space or light, etc., predation and disease. So what do you think is going to happen as this rabbit population increases? Will these factors increase, will they decrease, or will they stay the same? So pause the video and write down what you think would happen. So the answer is that when this population of rabbits increases, so too will the biotic factors like competition increase and disease, so it will control the number of rabbits that there are. So these biotic factors of predation, grazing, competition, disease, they all help to limit the population size. So for example, limit the population size of rabbits or limit the population size of humans, etc. So it doesn't end up being an overpopulation and using up too much resources. So these factors help to limit the population size along with lack of food and build-up of toxic waste. Let's look at all of the biotic factors in more detail, starting with competition. Competition in ecosystems occurs when resources are in short supply. Have a think about what plants and animals compete for before I go over the answers. The answers are that plants compete with each other for light, water, space, and soil nutrients, all the things that they need to survive. And animals compete with each other for food, water, space, and mates, again, everything that they need to survive. So there's some sunflowers competing for light, water, root space, and soil nutrients, and there's some animals competing for food, mates, and space. There are two types of competition that you need to know about, which are intraspecific competition and interspecific competition. So you need to know the definitions of both and be able to identify each of the different competitions. So we're going to first look at interspecific competition. So interspecific competition is a competition between individuals of different species requiring one or a few similar resources. They don't need exactly the same thing. So for example, a hyena and a lion competing. This occurs when two different species occupy the same ecological niche. This causes the least well-adapted species being pushed out of their habitat, so they are forced to migrate or they are forced to face extinction. Migration just means that they're forced to move. You can remember that interspecific competition is between different species because they both have ER in the word, which is highlighted. They are so different, has an ER in it, and interspecific has an ER. So you can watch different animals competing if you click the links of the squirrel and the lion versus hyena. So obviously a grey squirrel and a red squirrel are two different species, so that would be interspecific competition. Same with the brown trout and the rainbow trout, the hyena and the lion, and the sheep and the rabbit. Intraspecific competition is competition between members of the same species for exactly the same resource, so it's more intense because they want exactly the same thing. Any individual that fails to obtain the minimum requirements will die, so only the best competitor will survive. So natural selection will happen. You can watch the kangaroos competing together if you click on the link, but other examples would be rabbits competing for grass, cress seeds competing for soil nutrients, and you can remember that intraspecific is for competition for the same resource because intraspecific has an A and the same has an A. So intraspecific is the same species competing for the same resource. Now in class you would complete 2.1 competition worksheet where you would label the pictures with different types of competition. Instead of doing that, I'm going to show you pictures of competition and you're going to try to say what the type of competition is before I tell you the answer. So a lion and hyena competing for food. Do you think that's intraspecific competition or interspecific competition? Pause the video and write down what you think before I go over the answer. So the the answer is that it would be interspecific competition because they're different species. What about a clover plant competing for soil nutrients? Would that be intraspecific competition or interspecific competition? So remember, write it down before I go over the answer. So the answer would be intraspecific competition because they're clover plants, they're the same species. What about a fish and an algae living together? So write down what you think this would be. So the answer would be that they're not competing at all because they're living together, not competing for anything. What about water buffalo competing for water? Would that be intraspecific competition or interspecific competition? And the answer would be intraspecific competition because water buffalo are the same species that are competing. What about the Salix alba and the white willow competing for sunlight? Would that be intraspecific competition or interspecific competition? The answer is that it would be interspecific competition because they're both different species. Now, how about peacocks competing for mates? Would that be intraspecific competition or interspecific competition? It would be intraspecific competition because the peacocks would be the same species. And finally, the grey and red squirrel competing for food. Would that be intraspecific competition or interspecific competition? It would be interspecific competition because they are both different species. So well done if you managed to get them all correct. If not, then go watch the video again. Make sure you write out the definitions of intraspecific competition and interspecific competition over and over again until you know it. Intraspecific competition is very intense and more intense than interspecific competition because in intraspecific competition, the species are competing for exactly the same resources. So to reduce this intensity, the species can set up territories and that reduces competition. So a territory is an area marked and is defended for feeding. So a territory must supply enough food for the animal or group of animals within it. So many birds show territorial behaviour. So animals such as robins mark out and defend a territory. So all the food within that territory is then available for them and their offspring. This means intraspecific competition within territories is reduced. Robins use social signalling to warn off intruders, which include puffing out their breast and a high-pitched song. You can watch a robin marking out its territory by going to the link in the corner. Now we're finished with competition, let's look at another biotic factor that affects biodiversity. So let's look at grazing. So grazing is when animals feed on parts of plants. So for example, cows feeding on grass and your sheep feeding on your grass. What effect can grazing have on biodiversity? Which grassland do you think has been grazed most? So pause the video and put what one you think has been grazed the most and which one you think has been grazed the least before I go over the answer and how that's affected biodiversity. So this grassland here has been cut twice a year, mimicking moderate grazing effects by herbivores, and has the highest biodiversity because you can see there's lots of different species. So the less dominant plants have had a chance to survive. Whereas this grassland has not been grazed and not been cut for at least a year, and it only has one type of grass or plant or two, and that is because the dominant species of grass or plant have stopped other species from growing. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So if you have a high intensity of grazing or overgrazing, so you've got lots and lots of sheep on a field, then it's going to decrease biodiversity because more of the plant species are going to be eaten, and this can lead to plant species being destroyed. Whereas if you have moderate grazing, it maintains biodiversity and increases biodiversity because it allows the less dominant plants to survive because the faster growing plants that shade out the light are held in check by the grazing animals. And then the low intensity grazing, so undergrazing, so that's like no grazing or a little bit of grazing, decreases biodiversity because it allows only the better competitors, so the dominant plants, to succeed, and then they obviously become dominant and it only ends up being one or two plants. So the best way to have biodiversity with grazing is to have moderate grazing. So you don't want it to be overly grazed and you don't want it to be underly grazed. Now study the data in the table which shows the effects of grazing by rabbits on the number of plant species in a grassland area. Draw a graph of the data and answer the questions. The questions are: which type of graph should you plot? What number of rabbits resulted in the greatest biodiversity? And why is there an optimum number of rabbits for richness of biodiversity? Pause the video and try to answer the questions before I go over the answers. The first answer would be that we would need to draw a line graph because our data is two numbers. If our data was a number and a word, then we would have to draw a bar chart. So firstly, when we're doing a graph, we need to have our axis. So we need to have our x-axis and our y-axis, and we need to label both of them. So your number of rabbits per unit area is what you've controlled, so that would go on to the x-axis, and the number of species of flowering plants is what you've measured, so that would go on your y-axis. And you just take it exactly how it is said in the heading of the table. So then we need to work out what scale we're going to use. So our highest number is 50 on our x-axis. So the best number that we could go up in is probably tens in this case, but you just take it from coins. So you start off with 1, and then you go to 2, and then to 5, and then to 10, and then to 20, and then to 50, and then so on. So we need to double zero our origin always, and then go 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. Now for this case, we need to go up to 53 on our y-axis. So this time we're going to go up at 5, so 0, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, etc. So remember that you have to go up in an even scale, so the numbers have to be even. And then we'll start to plot our points. So you'd go to 0, and then you'd go up to 5, and then you'd put a cross, and then you'd go to 10, and then you'd go up to 11, and then you put a cross. You'd go along to 20, and then you'd go up to 35, and then you put a cross, and then you'd go along to 30, and then up to 53, and then you put a cross, and then you'd go along to 40, and then up to 44, and you'd put a cross, and then along to 50, and then up to 26, and then you put a cross. And then you would join all the crosses with a ruler. Obviously you wouldn't have these dotted lines, I was just showing you how you would put your plot points. So well done if you managed to draw your graph. So to get the next answer, we have to look at which number is highest for the number of species of flowering plants. So we know that this is 53. So when does this highest number occur? It's when the rabbits are at 30. So the answer would be 30 rabbits. So 30 rabbits are the optimum number of rabbits that result in the greatest flowering species biodiversity. And then the answer to the next question would be that there is an optimum number of rabbits for the richness of biodiversity, because when there's too many rabbits, then too many of the flowering species will be eaten and destroyed. And then if there's too little rabbits, then the best competitor of flowering species will survive and be dominant. So that'll end up only having 1 or 2 species of flower rather than lots of species of flower. So well done if you managed to get that correct. So we're away to move on to the next biotic factor. So we're going to look at predation. Predation also affects biodiversity, and predation is the eating of one organism by another. So for example, a tawny owl eating a small rodent. In this case, the predator is the animal that is eating the other animal. So the tawny owl would be the predator, and the prey is the animal that's getting eaten. So in this case, it would be the small rodent. And you need to know the words predator and prey and be able to identify what a predator is and what prey is. So how does your predation affect biodiversity? So let's have a look at that in greater detail. So high levels of predation cause a decrease in biodiversity as more organisms are eaten. Moderate levels of predation maintain or increased biodiversity as it keeps the dominant organisms in check, so it allows for more organisms to be there. Low levels of predation decrease biodiversity because more dominant organisms survive, so you end up only having a few organisms surviving. The number of predators in a population is closely tied to the size of its prey population, so both predator and prey follow a pattern. We are going to look into this in more detail by looking at the now famous data plotted above, which was collected by fur hunters working for the Hudson Bay Company in the late 19th century. So we're going to use this graph to answer the questions on the next slide. Questions are: which animal is the predator and which animal is the prey? Which population, predator or prey, increases first? Why do you think it is this way round? Why do you think the prey population falls? Why do you think the predator population falls? If the prey were to become extinct, what effects would this have on the population of predators? If the predators were to become extinct, what would happen to the population of prey? Think about your answers to 6 and 7. What might be the possible effects on other organisms in the ecosystem? So pause the video and use the graph to try to answer all of these questions before I go over the answers. So the answers are: the predator is the Canadian lynx and the prey is the snowshoe hare. As there always has to be a higher number of prey for the predator to be able to feed off of it. So the line that's above will be the one that corresponds to the prey, and the line that is further below will be the one that corresponds to the predator. So in this case, the snowshoe hare is the prey and the Canadian lynx is the predator. So the answer to number 2 is that the predator increases first, and the answer to number 3 is that the Canadian lynx, which is the predator, has plenty of prey, snowshoe hare, to feed on, so that's why it increases first. And then 4, the answer is that the prey population falls because there is more predators, Canadian lynx, eating them. Number 5 would be that the predator population falls because there is less prey, snowshoe hare, food to eat. And then number 6, if the prey were to become extinct, the population of predators, Canadian lynx, would decrease and would have to find an alternative food source. The next answer would be if the predator were to become extinct, the prey population would increase because they are no longer being hunted by the Canadian lynx. For question 8, if the Canadian lynx, which is the predator, decreases because the prey population is extinct, the Canadian lynx would need to find an alternative food source, so any of its other food sources would decrease. Anything that eats the Canadian lynx would decrease as their food source would decrease. Anything that eats the prey would decrease as their food source is extinct, and anything that competes with the snowshoe hare would increase because there would be less competition. For the answer to the next one, if the snowshoe hare, which is the prey, increases because the predator is extinct, anything that eats the snowshoe hare will decrease as there is more of them. Anything that eats the snowshoe hare will increase as there is more of them. And anything that competes with the snowshoe hare will decrease as there is more of them, so there will be more competition. So well done if you managed to get all of them correct. Pause the video and have a think about why would we need to investigate an ecosystem? Why might we need to find out what organisms live there, how many organisms live there, and why do we need to know what lives there? So the answer to this question is we need to know about organisms because we use them for food, raw materials, and medicines. So how do you think we could count all of the organisms in an ecosystem? It is not possible to count all the plants and animals in an ecosystem. Small samples are taken instead and estimates have to be made. To make this fair, sampling must be equal in size, random, and taken more than once. Can you remember how we sampled organisms in third year and what these pictures are of? Pause the video and try to write it down before I go over the answers. So the first picture is of a quadrat and it is used to sample plants. And the second picture is of a pitfall trap and it's used to sample soil invertebrates. So therefore plants can be sampled using a quadrat and soil invertebrates can be sampled using a pitfall trap. So let's look at the quadrat first. So a quadrat is a square frame of a known area divided into equally sized smaller squares. It is used to estimate the abundance numbers of plants in an area. So usually the quadrat's made up of 25 squares and it's usually 0.25 meters squared. So the rules of quadrats are that quadrats should be thrown at random and as many as possible should be used to give a representative result. So to minimize any errors, quadrats should be thrown randomly so that not to distort the results. The number of squares containing the plant in the quadrat should be counted, not the number of plants in each square. If the plant is over half, it's counted. If it's under half, it's not. If we were to throw this quadrat and we got this result, how would we know how many plantain, dandelion, buttercup and grass there was? So pause the video and try to write down the number of plantains, dandelion, buttercup and grass. So the answer would be that you need to count the number of squares containing each plant, not the number of plants. So for plantain, there would be 3. So we look at the key. Plantain looks like that. So the 1 square contains it, 2 squares contain it, and 3 squares contain it. The next one would be that dandelions is 5. So we look at dandelions, which is this orange circle. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then we've got our buttercup. So there would be 8 buttercups. So buttercup's the yellow square. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And then the last one is our grass. So 24. So everyone has grass in it apart from this one. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If you didn't, then pause the video and try to figure out. So let's do the same for this next quadrat. So this quadrat was thrown at random. Let's calculate the number of daisies, plantain, buttercups, and dandelions. So try to do it on your own. Pause the video and then I will go over the answers. So the answer would be that there is 4 daisies. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 6 daisies. Then for our plantain, we have 2. So 1, 2. For our buttercups, we have got 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And lastly, for our dandelions, we have 2. So 1 because that's less than half, that bit there, and 2. So 2 for dandelions. So well done if you got that correct. If you didn't, then go back and watch the quadrat again. So how do we estimate the number of plants in the area? So firstly, we have to work out the average number of each plant type. So you'd have to add up all the plants and then divide them by the number of quadrats there was. Then your quadrat is only 0.25, so we need to we figured out how much is in the 0.25 meters squared, but we want to know how much is in 1 meter squared of area. So to do that, we need to then figure out how many times 0.25 goes into 1, which is 4. So we then need to times whatever number we get by 4, so the number of plants times by 4. Then we would times it by the area that we had. So let's go through an example of So copy out this table so that you can fill it out. So your quadrat is 25 squares, so each quadrat is 0.25 meters squared in length. And you're going to look at daisies, plantains, dandelions, and you're going to have a look at 4 different quadrats. So pause the video, write this down before we go over what we're going to do. Now you've got your table, try to work out the answer for each of the 4 quadrats that have been thrown in this specific area. So pause the video and try to work out the answers before I go over them. So firstly, let's look at quadrat number 1, this one here. So let's look at daisies first. So our key's over here. So daisies are square. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 daisies. So our first answer would be 4. And then we want to look at plantains, which is a circle. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 plantains. And then we want to look at dandelions, which is the triangle. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So well done if you got the first quadrat right. So now let's look at quadrat number 2. Quadrat number 2. So let's go for daisies. So 1, 2, 3, 4. For plantains, which are the circles. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Let's go for dandelions, which is the triangle. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Again, well done if you got that one correct. Now let's go for number 3. So squares again. So 1, 2, 3, 4 for daisies. Then plantain. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 for plantain. And for dandelions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then last one, number 4. So for daisies, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. For plantain, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. For dandelions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So well done if you managed to get all 4 quadrats correct. Now remember, to work out the number of plants, or to estimate the number of plants in an area, you need to work out the average. So to work out the average of anything, you need to calculate the total, and then you need to divide it by the number of samples that are there. So total, then divide by samples. So in this case, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 samples. So we need to add 4, add 4, add 4, add 6, which gives us a total of 18. Remember to click the equals button before you divide it. So we'll have 4.5 if we divide 18 by 4. And then we've got, for our average number of plantains, we've got to do 4 add 7, add 9, add 9, which would give us a total number of 29. So remember, click equals before you divide it by 4. So that should give us 7.25. Then lastly, our average number of dandelions. So you do 5, add 8, add 7, add 6, which will give us a total number of 26. So you remember to click the equals button, then divide it by 4, gives you 6.5. Now this would be our number in 0.25 meters, but we're wanting to know our number in 1 meter squared. So you've got to be careful with whatever this number is. So to get from 0.25 to 1 meter, we'd need to times it by 4. So we need to times all of our numbers by 4. So 4.5 times by 4 is going to give us a total abundance of 18 in 1 meter squared. Then for our next one, 7.25 times 4 would give us 29, and 6.5 times by 4 would give us 26. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If you didn't, it is a common question, so make sure you watch over it, this part of the video again. So now let's look at pitfall traps. So pitfall traps are used to sample small invertebrates living on the ground. So usually it's a yogurt pot or a similar small tub, and then usually it's got a lid, but you need to make sure that you don't close off the pitfall trap, and it's usually in line with the ground. So a pitfall trap is dug into the ground for animals to fall into. The size of the pitfall trap depends on what you are sampling. So the most common is crawling insects, so it's usually about yogurt pot size. Some of the pitfall traps are set to kill insects. Why do you think that is? And a lid is also important. Why do you think that is? So pause the video and write down why you think that is. You should know from third year before I go over the answers. So, a possible source of error for pitfall traps is not carrying out enough samples. So, obviously, you'll find insects in some parts and not other parts. So, you need to carry out as many samples as possible so that it makes it reliable. So, always repeating an experiment to increase the reliability. Another possible error would be the loss of animals feeding on others. So, some of the insects might eat the other insects. So to minimize that error, you would have to check the traps regularly, or you could use a lid for camouflage, or you could add some ethanol at the bottom and set it up to kill the organisms that fall in so that you can see what you've collected. So you've also got another possible source of error of a pitfall trap, which would be animals avoiding the trap. So they might be able to see the cup and be like, oh, I'm not going in there. So you can stop that from happening by making sure that your cup is flush with the ground, so it's level with the ground and blends into the habitat. This table just summarises these two sampling techniques, so try to fill it out before I go over the answers. So what does the technique sample? What is the possible sources of error, and how would you minimise the error? So both of them sample plants and small invertebrates. The possible source of error for both of them would be that the numbers and types of organisms may not represent the whole ecosystem. So you might not find some rare organisms in your trap. So to minimise that error, you would need to take several samples to make the results more reliable. So repeating the experiment, always making it reliable, and that is a common question that you get asked in exams. So for the next one, you've got your pitfall trap. So its technique would be to put a cup or other container placed so that the top of it is level with the ground, and then you'd camouflage it. Your organism that it would sample would be small invertebrates or small soil animals. Its possible source of error would be that organisms may not be able to climb into the container. And to minimize this error, you should make sure that the container is in line with the soil surface. Another possible source of error would be that trapped organisms may be eaten by birds. So how you minimize this error would be to cover the trap with a raised stone or leaf, so it camouflages the trap. Now watch when you're writing covers it or putting a lid on it, because it needs to be so that the organisms can get in. So it's better just to write camouflage the trap. And the next possible source of error of a pitfall trap would be that trapped organisms may eat each other. So how to minimize that would be to use a preservative such as ethanol in the trap so it kills the insects, or you can check the traps more regularly. And quadrats. So quadrats are a technique, and they're a square frame, and they've got a known area divided into smaller size squares, usually 25. The organisms it's used to sample is plants, and its possible source of error would be that quadrats are not placed randomly. So how you minimize that source of error would be to throw the quadrat randomly. And then your other possible source of error of a quadrat is that some plants that are partly in the quadrat are included and others are not. So how to minimize that error would be to establish a rule for plants that are partially included and apply consistently to all quadrats in the study. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If not, then you need to learn this table and pause the video. Okay, so why, if we can collect lots of insects in the pitfall trap, can we not collect butterflies? So pause the video and write down how you think we cannot collect butterflies. So the reason that we can't collect butterflies is they have wings so that they can fly out of the cup. And that was a question once, just make sure you know that. Once we've sampled organisms, we need to be able to identify the organism. In order to identify unfamiliar organisms, we would use a key. Scientists use keys to help identify things. So characteristics are used to separate one thing from another. There are two different types of keys, which are branching keys and paired statement keys. You should have looked at the keys in third year, but we will go over them again. So first, let's start with branching keys. When using a branching key, you must always start at the top. If you follow the line of the key, you will be given a choice to make. So you then go to the correct choice for the organism. So study your organism and make the appropriate choice. If your organism is in the key, you should eventually finish with its name. An example of a key is this. In an exam, you may be provided with a picture of an organism and asked to identify it by a key, or you may need to fill in parts of a key that are missing, or you might need to find characteristics of an organism using a key. So let's try to identify all of these different pictures by the branching key and go over how you use one. So I will help you with A, and then I want you to pause the video and try and find B to G yourself. So for A, we need to go to start. Then we need to figure out, does it have legs or no legs? Well, we can quite clearly see it's got legs, and then it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 legs. So it's got more than 6 legs, and it's got 8 legs, so it will be a mite. Right, so pause the video and try and answer the rest of them. So the answer would be for B, you'd go to start. It's not got any legs, and it's got a shell, so it's going to be a snail. For the next one, it's going to have legs, as you can see the little legs on it, and it has more than 6 legs, and it's got more than 8 legs, so it's going to be a millipede. So this one's got legs, it's got 6 legs, so it's either going to be a beetle or an ant. And for E, we know that it's not got any legs, it's not got a shell, and it's got a segmented body because it's split into sections, so it's going to be an earthworm. For the next one, it's got no legs, it's got no shell, and its body's not segmented, so it's going to be a slug. Well done if you managed to get that correct. And for the last one, it's got legs, it's got 6 legs, so it's going to be an ant or beetle. Well done if you managed to get them all correct. So we just separate our organisms with their characteristics. So you always have a question that has one way or another route to go down. So for example, it's got legs or it's not got legs. It's got a shell or it's not got a shell. We can identify our organisms by their characteristics. So well done if you managed to do that. So let's look at the other type of question we might get. Identify 3 features of an earthworm. So for this type of question where you have to identify features, you have to work your way backwards. So we can see earthworms here, so we need to know what characteristics it has. So we've got to go back up the branch key. So it's got a segmented body, it's got no shell, and it's got no legs. So that's your 3 features or characteristics of your earthworm. So it has a segmented body, has no shell, and has no legs. So pause the video and try to identify 2 features of a snail before I go over the answers. So the answers would be that a snail has a shell and it has no legs. So its 2 features would be that it has a shell and it has no legs. So well done if you managed to get that correct. So see if you can create a branching key to identify these pond animals. So look at the features of all of these and try to separate them. So an obvious place to start might be that 1 or 2 of them have shells and the other ones don't have a shell. So that could separate them, and then think about legs, etc. So an example of one I have done is that you've got your pond animal and then you've got shell, no shell, pointed spiral shell, round spiral shell, no legs, legs, no tail, tail, 8 legs or more than 8 legs. And then that should separate all of your different organisms. So number 1 would be your ramshore snail. Number 2, your mayfly nymph. Number 3, your water louse. Number 4, your pond snail. 5, your flatworm. And 6, your water mite. Because your ramshore snail has a round spiral shell and it's got a shell. Your mayfly nymph, it has a tail, it's got legs, it's got no shell. So that would be your mayfly nymph. Your water louse has got more than 8 legs, it's got no tail, it has legs, and it has no shell. Your pond snail has a shell, and this time it's a pointed spiral shell. Your flatworm has no shell, no legs, and your water mite, it has no shell, it's got legs, it's got no tail, and it's got 8 legs. so that separates all of your different water pond animals. Right, so try to identify a feature of a pond snail and pause the video. So a feature of the pond snail would be that it has a shell and that it has a pointed spiral shell. Well done if you managed to get that correct. If not, and you're struggling with keys, go back and watch the branching key part again. The other type of key that you need to know is the paired statement key, which again you should have covered in third year. So paired statement keys work in the same way as branching keys. At each stage you're given a choice, make the appropriate choice and go to where you are asked to go. Again, if the organism is present, you should end up with a name for it. Each of the statement has two options, which are opposite to each other. So like you've got leaf with prickles, leaf with no prickles, and then it'll either tell you what the organism is or it will tell you go to a number. So I'm going to do A with you and then I'm going to get used to B, C, D to H on your own. So for A, is it a single leaf or does it have several leaflets? It's a single leaf, so we need to go to 2. So go to 2, so leaf with prickles or leaf with no prickles. So it has no prickles, so we want to go to 3. Leaf edge with lobes or leaf edge with no lobes. It's with lobes, so we want to go to 4. And then the lobes are sharp and pointed, or the lobes are rounded. The lobes would be rounded, so the first one would be oak. So well done if you managed to get that correct. So try to do the other ones before I go with answers with you. Right, the answer for B is that it's a single leaf, so we need to go to 2. So the leaf with prickles or no prickles, so it's no prickles, so go to 3. The leaf edge with lobes or no lobes, so no lobes, so we've got to go to 5. And the leaf with a smooth edge or a serrated edge has got a serrated edge, so it would be the elm. Well done if you managed to get that correct. So let's look at C. So this time it's got several leaflets, so we're going to go to 6. Then our leaflets are in pairs, so we need to go to 7. And then our leaf edge is plain, not serrated, so it would be ash. Right, so for D, the answer would be that you need to go to 6 because it's leaflets. Then we have got our leaf with, so we've got to go to 6. So our leaflets are in pairs, so we've got to go to 7. And our leaf has a serrated edge, so it's going to be round this time. Well done if you managed to get that correct. Okay, so for E, we've got several leaflets, so we have to go to 6. And our leaflets are in a fan shape, so it's going to be the horse. Well done if you got that correct. Let's go over F. So F is a single leaf, so we've got to go to 2. And the leaf has prickles, so it's going to be holly. So for G, it is going to be a single leaf, so we've got to go to 2. It's got no prickles, so we've got to go 3. And it has got a leaf edge with no lobes, so we've got to go 5. And then it's got a smooth edge, so it's going to be B. Right, so for the last one, it's got a single leaf, so we've got to go 2. Has no prickles, so we've got to go 3. And then it's got lobes, so we've got to go 4. And then its lobes are sharp and pointed, so it's going to be a sycamore. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If not, then try to do this paired statement. So, like you can be asked to identify features in a branching key, you can also be asked to identify features in a paired statement key. And again, you need to work backwards. So identify 3 features of a rowan. So you can pause the video and try to do this yourself, or you can let me talk you through this one. So first of all, we need to go to rowan, and then we need to work our way back. So we know that the leaf edge is serrated for rowan, so that's going to be one of its features. And then we know that we've had to go to 7. So the one statement that says quota 7 says leaflets in pairs. So we know that Rowan has to have its leaflets in pairs. So that's fine, that can be another characteristic. And we know this is statement 6, so we've had to go to statement 6. We have to go to wherever it says go to statement 6. So go to 6 is up here, which means that it's got several leaflets. So its three characteristics would be that it's got several leaflets, it has got leaflets in pairs, and it's got leaf edge serrated. So it has a straight leaf edge, has leaflets in pairs, and has several leaflets. So try to identify 3 features of the sycamore on your own. So pause the video and try to do that by yourself before I go over the answer. So the answer would be, you need to look at a sycamore, and we know that it's got lobes sharp pointed, and we know we've had to go 4 to get that information. So we go to 4 and we go with the statement that it is. So it says leaf edge with lobes. So its leaf edge must have lobes. And we've had to go to 3 to get that statement, so we've got to go to 3 bit. And then it says leaf with no prickles. So we've had to go to statement 2 to get that. So we need to go to the go to 2 part, and that would be single leaf. So it's got a single leaf, it has no prickles, it's got a leaf edge with a lobe, and it's got a sharp pointed lobe. So has sharp pointed lobes, has leaf edge with lobes, and has a leaf with no prickles, and has a single leaf. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If not, then go back to the bit that we've started to identify features, because you need to know how to do that. Okay, so now that we've looked at a paired statement key, see if you can make a paired statement key to identify and separate all of these different dogs. So pause the video and try to do that now before I go over an example that I've already tried. So you can look at the size of the dog, you can maybe look at the size of their tail, the size of their fur, whether they've got patches on their body, their ears, etc. This is an example of a paired statement key separating these dogs. So I've done smaller and larger dogs, tails, fur, their different types of coat, and their different types of ears. So the first one is an Egyptian Greyhound, because it has got patches on its body, it's got short fur, and it has got it's a larger dog. For the next one, it is a Jack Russell, because it's got a short tail and it's a smaller dog. The next one's a Working Collie, because it's got long fur and it's a larger dog. The next one's a Labrador Retriever, because its ears are flat. It's got a plain coloured body. It's got short fur and it's a larger dog. And number 5 is a Bull Terrier, so its ears are pointed. It's got a plain coloured body. It's got short fur and it's a larger dog. And then the last one is a Chihuahua, because it's got a long tail and it is a smaller dog. Well done if you managed to make your own paired statement key, because they're quite tricky to do. So again, here's an identify the features question. So pause the video and try to identify 3 features of a Bull Terrier before I go for the answer. So the answer would be that you have to look at Bull Terrier, and it has pointed ears, and then we would have to have went to 5, so we've got to go to 5. So it's got a plain coloured body, and to get there we would have had to have gone to 4. So it also got a short fur, and to get there we had to have gone to 3. So it must be a larger dog. So we've got larger dog, short fur, plain coloured body, and pointed ears. So well done if you managed to get that correct. We've now come to the end of the lesson, so you should now be able to define the ecological terms predator, prey, grazing, abiotic, and biotic, state what competition is and identify what plants and animals compete for, know the difference between intra-specific competition and inter-specific competition, describe how abiotic and biotic factors affect biodiversity, describe how to sample plants and animals, state possible sources of error with each method and explain how to minimize them, create and use branch, key, and paired statements to identify organisms. Well done if you can confidently do all of that. If you can't, then you need to watch this video again. That is the end of the video tutorial. Woohoo! Thank you for listening.